With this simple palette, you can achieve a broad range of color. Remember that the earth tones help create a sense of value for color and reflect subtle color shifts like on the color wheel. When laid out flat on a figure, the earth tones also provide the feeling of a temperature range that will help as soon as you tint with color. This is my palette setup. I have a reusable enamel tray to mix my paint on. I place my colors on a wet paper towel inside the tray to keep them wet longer. When I'm done, I'll cover my tray with saran wrap to prevent it from drying. When I start my gesture drawing, I use burnt sienna and look for an interplay of shapes created by the pose of the figure. Major axis lines like the tilt of the head, the clavicle bone below the neck, the bottom of the rib cage, direction of the hips, legs, arms, and feet can visually be extended as lines across your picture plane and create a shape as soon as it hits another axis line. These shapes will help you place the figure on your page. Everything is planar structure. Shapes are drawn from the context of other shapes. Notice how, because of the pose in the right leg, the line from the knee down connects into the ball of the foot, and the heel and toes branch out from this axis line as simple triangles. Use your brush as a sketching tool rather than a painting tool at this phase, and draw with it. The paint should be thought of as ink, so that you can achieve different opacities with water. Notice how I'm subtly drawing the edges of my shapes. Instead of drawing a curvilinear line in the left knee or calf, I'm thinking of the anatomy and plane of that area and building out. The right edge of that form is slightly directed out on an angle that opposes the overall direction of the leg. This causes the eye to visually read it as curved. With more color added on top later, you can continue to render to whatever extent you want. I tend to think of my figure drawing like a high-key black and white drawing, where the highlight edges or lines may blend into the paper and the shadows are more prominent. This takes time to build up practice, but it helps me see the interplay of shapes across the figure. When I start adding color on top, I've found that it fills in the gaps of what I leave out in the beginning and keeps me interested. Next, I apply a light wash of burnt sienna again over the top so that the white of the surface is knocked back. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm also going to add ultramarine blue. This will create a unified coolness to the colors that I add on top. If I don't want a sense of blue, I'll have to mix my highlights warmer. Using John Assaro's planes of the head, blue highlights turn to purple in midtones around the bridge of the nose and between the eyebrows. The eye sockets in the deepest shadow turn yellow or green, and the jaw turns orange because it's receiving bounced light. Thus, a blue light spectrum will turn warm or orange because they are opposite each other on the color wheel. Now I'm blocking in my darkest shadow shapes with raw umber, because it's the coolest earth tone, with a slightly bluish quality. Remember to use a flat brush so that you cover more surface area, and follow the planes of the body, because the angle of your shapes will be more correct. Keep looking back and forth between the model in front of you and your paper so that you draw what's really in front of you. Light your model in a way that creates distinct shapes of light and shadow, and it will be easier to paint. Depending on your reference, you may need to accentuate some shadows in order to sculpt the figure from the background. Next, I'll block in my brightest highlight shapes. Here I'm using cadmium red light, yellow ochre, and white to begin. I may need to also add cadmium yellow medium. I start at the top where the figure catches the most direct warm light and work my way down. I notice that the highlight color on my reference starts to shift cooler as it leads down, so I'll come back to that in a minute. Remember that form shadows on the figure have soft edges, and highlight shapes range from hard to soft, depending on how the light is being cast over the form. Notice how the cool highlight shape on the left thigh gradually gets softer on the right and mixes with the midtone wash to achieve a sense of rendering. Now I block in other shadow shapes with burnt umber. These are areas next to and coming out of the darkest raw umber shadows. They begin to warm up because they are receiving some light. They are not quite as dark, but also not that bright. At this point, your figure should have a fairly even amount of value distribution and temperature because the midtone fills in a lot of the work between your highlights and shadows. At this point, I like to block in my background so that I see how my values and color are relating. I'm starting with white here and then adjusting accordingly. You can get opaque with the white in areas next to the edge of the form that you want to draw more contrast to and round out. I'll get transparent with white in other areas that can just rest back. Notice how there are even shapes in the background. These make the figure come forward and complement the angle of the pose by helping its sense of design within your four edges of the picture plane. I now add raw sienna in the shapes that are coming out of the highlights and into the midtone. I'm adding the color of the scarf now to create a focal point of saturated color. This will help me determine if I need to adjust the lights and shadows of the figure later on. Now that I'm happy with my value distribution, I'm going to concentrate on pushing my color in the highlights and shadows and refine until finish. Be mindful of your shapes as they sculpt the form and pay attention to hard and soft edges interacting with light and shadow. In the next painting, I'm going to add permanent green light to my burnt sienna wash in the beginning. This will create another unified coolness to the colors that I add on top. If I don't want a sense of green, I'll have to mix my highlights and shadows differently. Green highlights turn yellower in midtones around the bridge of the nose and between the eyebrows. The eye socket in the deepest shadow turns orange or red, and the jaw turns blue because it's receiving bounced light. Thus, a green light spectrum will turn warm or red because they are opposite each other on the color wheel.